The math fella, he does real math. Gives you guidance, puts you on the path. With today's lesson, he is in the zone. So come on now, let's get going.
Howdy, Math Fella here today, and we are going to be working with completing the square. Not a real difficult mathematically to work with, but a lot of steps, as you can see on this slide. A couple of things it's used for. One, if you want to find the vertex form, you're trying to find the vertex of a parabola pointing up or down. You can use completing the square. The other is you may be looking to use it to solve for a quadratic equation, and that's what we'll be walking through today. I'm going to take you through these particular steps here, talking through now, then we'll go through mathematically to see how those work. So first step is we'll move all constants to the right. So if it's not an x term, there's not a variable with that, we'll move those to the right side of the equality, leave all the x terms on the left. I need a positive 1 in front of my x squared term, so we're going to divide everything by any term number or coefficient that may be tied to that. Next I will divide my term that goes with x by 2, so I'll be cutting that one in half. I'll then multiply that result by itself. So if I get a question mark after I divide it by 2, I'm going to square that question mark. Next I add that value to both sides, so I'm not changing the value of the equation, both sides of the equality. Next comes the key thing I'm doing is I'm going to take the quadratic form of the equation and replace it with the perfect square. We'll see how that happens, and that's kind of the key turning point in this solution. Next I will then be able to take the square root of both sides. I'm doing an even root, so I'll get a plus and minus for a solution. And then I will solve for the x, which will be my goal. Okay, here's the equation we are working with today. Note we got a 3 for a coefficient. First step, we talked about m, and I'll be highlighting each movement up here. We're going to move the numbers without an x to the right side. So that's that 21 that's here. So I'm moving it over here. I'm subtracting 21 from both sides. So it means it disappears from this side, appears over here as a negative 21. So that's our first step. That's the m. Next movement is I've got to get rid of that 3. I need a positive 1 in front of that equation, so I'm dividing the whole thing by 3. Multiply or divide each of those terms by that 3 to give me this value. So this is really what I'm going to be working with on completing the square. So I've divided all the terms by that 3. In order to complete the square, we need that x squared with a coefficient of positive 1, which I have right there. So now I've moved to my third activity here. Now I'm dividing the number with the x. So this value here, moved it down, also existing here, dividing that by 2. So that gives me a 4 listed right there. And then to prepare myself for where I'm going is I'm going to rewrite the equation showing where the perfect square is going to be. Now this is the perfect square we just built, right? I just divided that 8 by 2, and that gave me my perfect square. But to produce that, I'm going to need to add something here, and if I add it on that side of the equality, here's the equality, I've got to add it on the other side. And then as I pull down to the next step, I'm just going to pull that value on down here. Okay, so our next view, again, this is what we started with. We're able to get several terms on this particular page. Now, here's the 4, where I've taken the 8, cut it in half. Now I square that 4, multiply that perfect square term by itself. So I'm squaring that term to get the 16 that goes here and here. I've added it to both sides of the equality so that I haven't changed the value. And then, key thing is I'm replacing the quadratic expression. So here's your quadratic, and here's my perfect square. Those are actually the same value. If I multiply x plus 4 times itself, it gives me what's right here. So that's a big crux of completing the square, is being able to replace your quadratic, which is right here, with your perfect square term. Okay, let's see where we go from there. That's really the difficult part done. And now we want to really go through just what's left with the solution. So again, here's a term we started with. Now I'm working on t, which is taking the square root. So here's where we ended up with on the last slide. And now I'm going to take the square root of both sides. If I continue with that solving, having that square root value gives me x plus 4 on one side, plus and minus. Remember, I'm taking an even root, so I have plus and minus of this value, which gives me a plus and minus of 3. And now I go to my last step, which is actually solving for the x value. So here we solve both plus 3 and the minus 3. Here are my two roots, my two solutions, my two zeros. You may hear all of those terms for that, of the quadratic equation we started with here after we had divided by 3 and came up with this term. So that's how you go through the solving for completing the square. Let's jump to this next slide. So I'm going to give you a chance to kind of work some on your own. If you're working with this equation, I'm going to let you get that one down. We're going to move on to the next slide so you can kind of see the steps. And then the slide after that one will have the worked out solution. So on the next slide, I'm going to ask you to pause it, work through those steps to complete that square, and then move on to the next slide to check against the solution. So on this slide, I have the steps lined out. We'll walk through each of those steps. Got your guidance here. You're solving a quadratic equation. So go ahead and pause here, and then when you've completed your activities working through those steps, then go to the next slide and check against that solution. Okay, I hope that worked well. Listed the solution here, the equation you started with. Cut that 12 in half to get your 6. Squared that 6 to get your two 36s. Simplified down to this form, took the square root of both sides. So this gave you 4 for that one. So that 4 shows up here as plus and minus. Move my 6 to the other side of equality. So you got negative 6 plus 4 is the negative 2. Negative 6 minus 4 is your negative 10. Congratulations, you now can complete the square.